Title: Beyond the Threshold. Chapter 1. The First Door. The night was thick with an unsettling silence as Lena walked home, her footsteps echoing against the damp pavement. A light drizzle had begun to fall, the kind that kissed the skin but never truly soaked through. The streets were empty, save for the occasional shadow of a passing car. Lena adjusted her scarf around her neck, a futile attempt to ward off the chill that seemed to creep from the very air itself. She was tired, the kind of exhausted that clung to her bones and whispered dark thoughts in the quiet of the night. It had been a long day at the office, filled with frustrating meetings and unspoken words that lingered like fog in her mind. She was almost home, her apartment building only a block away, when something caught her eye. It was a door. At first, Lena didn't recognize it for what it was. She thought it was just another trick of the rain, perhaps a reflection from one of the nearby streetlights. But as she drew closer, her breath hitched in her throat. It wasn't the door to a building. There was no frame around it, no familiar outline. Just the door, standing alone, as though it had always been there, waiting. The soft glow of the streetlights made the brass handle gleam, and the faded wood looked ancient, warped by time and weather. It was out of place, unnatural in its solitude. There was no reason for it to be there, and yet it stood, unwavering, in the middle of the empty street. Lena stopped, her heart quickened, a strange unease creeping through her chest. She had seen this kind of thing before in stories, doors that led to other places, other worlds, often with a promise of something extraordinary or dangerous behind them. But those were stories, fiction, fantasies people wove to explain the inexplicable. This wasn't a story, this was real. She felt a pull toward it, a gravitational force that seemed to draw her in despite the small rational part of her mind telling her to keep walking, to turn back and go home. But something inside her was stronger than the voice of caution. It whispered to her, beckoning her closer. Without thinking, she reached out and touched the cold, weathered surface of the door. The moment her fingers made contact, a jolt of electricity shot up her arm. It wasn't painful, but it was enough to make her step back, startled. Her breath caught in her throat, but she couldn't bring herself to move away. There was something undeniable about it. The door was calling her. For a moment, Lena hesitated, looking around the street to see if anyone was nearby, but it was deserted. There were no sounds, no footsteps, no cars, just the gentle patter of rain and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. The door stood there, waiting. The handle gleamed under the streetlight, and the temptation was overwhelming. It was as if the door was challenging her, daring her to open it, to step through. Lena had always been one to resist the unknown. She was a woman who dealt in logic, in the tangible world of deadlines and meetings, where things made sense. But now, in the silence of the night, she felt an irrational curiosity clawing at her. What was on the other side? What could possibly be behind this inexplicable door in the middle of nowhere? The question lingered in the air as she took a deep breath and turned the handle. It gave way with a soft click, as though the door had been waiting for her touch all along. The door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges. The darkness beyond seemed to pull her in, inviting her like a forgotten memory. Lena stepped over the threshold. As she crossed into the darkened space beyond the door, Lena immediately felt a shift in the atmosphere. The air was heavier, colder, and the faint scent of dust filled her nose. The room was large, but there were no windows, no source of light other than the faint glow that leaked from the edges of the door behind her. Her breath quickened as she glanced around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The walls were bare, made of a dark stone that seemed to absorb the faint light. The floor was polished marble, black as midnight, with veins of white running through it like cracks in a fractured sky. There were no furnishings, no doors, no windows, just the endless emptiness that stretched around her. Lena felt her pulse race. She should turn back, she thought. She should go home, but there was no turning back now, not after crossing the threshold. The door had closed behind her with a soft thud, and when she reached for the handle to open it again, she found it locked, no longer responding to her touch. Panic began to rise in her chest. She was alone in this cold, dark place. No one knew where she was. Her mind raced, searching for an explanation. This was some kind of prank, right? Someone was messing with her. She turned in a circle, scanning the room, but there was no one. No hidden cameras, no tricksters lurking in the corners. She tried the door again, pulling with all her strength, but it remained stubbornly shut. Her breath quickened as she pounded on the door, calling out, but her voice fell flat in the vast emptiness. The silence around her was deafening. There was only one thing to do. She had to explore. She had to find another way out. With her heart pounding in her chest, Lena took a cautious step forward, her footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. She walked deeper into the darkness, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. After a few steps, she noticed something strange. The walls, once smooth and uniform, began to shift, the stones warping and bending as though alive. Her pulse quickened. She knew she was seeing things now. This couldn't be real, could it? But the sensation was undeniable. The air grew heavier, more suffocating, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching toward her. The temperature dropped, and her breath misted in front of her, cold as ice. Her instincts screamed at her to turn around, to find a way back to the door she had come through. But something stopped her, a faint whisper. A murmur so soft she wasn't sure it was real, came from somewhere ahead of her. Lena froze, straining her ears. It wasn't a language she could recognize, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was in this place with her. The voice came again, louder this time, and with it, a low hum, like the sound of distant machinery or something far below the ground. Lena's heart raced. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't. Suddenly the ground beneath her feet shifted. The floor cracked with a sharp, thunderous sound, and the walls groaned as if they were alive. Lena's body tensed. She had to move. She had to get out. But before she could turn to run, the darkness swallowed her whole. The sensation of falling was overwhelming. She could feel the pull of gravity, the earth rushing up to meet her. But there was no ground to land on, no solid surface beneath her feet. She flailed, trying to grasp at the void, but it slipped through her fingers, as if the world itself was made of smoke. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Lena gasped for air, her body shaking with the sudden release. She opened her eyes, blinking against the blinding light. She wasn't sure how long she had been falling, or if it had even been real. Before her was another door. This opening chapter introduces the central mystery of the story, the appearance of the door, the strange and unsettling environment Lena finds herself in, and the hints of something much darker at play. The eerie atmosphere, her increasing sense of panic, and the feeling of being drawn into something she can't control, set the tone for the rest of the story, building suspense and intrigue. If you'd like me to continue expanding this further, I can do so in additional parts. Chapter 2. The Whispering Darkness. Lena's head spun as the light hit her, blinding her for a moment. It wasn't the soft, diffuse glow she had expected from some far-off, comforting source. No, this light was sharp and cold, like the gaze of an ancient, uncaring deity. It flared around her, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the stone floor beneath her feet. She blinked, her eyes struggling to adjust. For a brief moment, she thought she was back in the street, the door to nowhere behind her, the cold rain falling in rhythm with her heartbeat. But the sounds of the night were gone. The air had changed. It was heavy, thick with an unnatural weight. She could taste the sharpness in her throat. The air was too dry, too still. Lena stood frozen, her heart thudding in her chest, unsure of what to do next. Before her stood yet another door, a dark wooden frame with intricate carvings that seemed to writhe and twist with life, the edges glowing faintly as if alive, like a pulse beneath the surface. The door didn't seem to belong in this place, neither here nor anywhere. It was not a door to a room, but perhaps to a space, a void, or something beyond all that she knew. But this door wasn't like the first. No gleaming handle invited her to open it. No comforting promise beckoned from beyond. The carvings on it were twisted and grotesque, like the contorted faces of forgotten things. The first door had called to her, drawn her in, and in that moment, She had been curious, almost willing to accept whatever came next. But this second door, this one felt different. There was no noise, not a creak or a groan, as if this place itself had swallowed every sound. She reached out instinctively, but pulled her hand back just before it touched the cold wood. The whispering had started again, low and guttural, echoing in the back of her mind. "Come! Come!" It was so faint, so subtle, that Lena wasn't sure if it was a sound she was hearing or a thought, something tugging at the very edges of her sanity. But it was there. It was unmistakable. The voice, if it could even be called that, spoke with a strange familiarity, a distorted echo of her own inner thoughts, but so much darker, more insistent. It didn't demand her attention. It simply was. Her skin prickled with cold, not the chill of the night, but the cold that seemed to rise from within her, as though her body itself was rejecting the space around her. She stumbled back a step, then another, her breathing shallow as she tried to make sense of the situation. Where was she? What was this place? There were no answers. The silence seemed to stretch endlessly, and the air had become thick, almost viscous, like wading through a thick fog that didn't clear, a fog that clouded not just her sight, but her very mind. Lena's instincts screamed at her to turn around, to run, but there was no way to run. The door behind her had vanished, no longer an option for escape. It was as if this space, this dark and silent room, had absorbed it, swallowed it whole, leaving only the terrifying unknown ahead. Where am I?" she whispered into the silence, the words strangling themselves before they could even leave her lips. No answer came, but the whispering, that insidious sound, grew louder, more tangible, curling around her like an invisible snake. "Come closer, just a little farther." Lena closed her eyes for a moment, fighting the rising panic. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on her, heavy and unyielding. The light that had surrounded her now flickered, dimming, then flaring back to life in irregular pulses, each flash of light casting grotesque, shifting shadows that warped and stretched. For a moment, she thought she saw something in the shadows, a shape, a figure just on the edge of her vision. It was too fleeting, too fast to be sure of, but it felt wrong. Something in the back of her mind, something primal, deep, told her to move, to do anything other than stand there, waiting for whatever this thing was to consume her. She turned her head toward the door once again, but it was no longer simply a door. It had changed. The carvings had shifted, no longer abstract lines and patterns, but now detailed faces. Faces of twisted, anguished souls, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes hollow and full of despair. It was as if the door itself had become a living thing, absorbing the souls of those who dared to approach. Lena stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. Her heart hammered in her chest. She should have never opened that first door, never stepped through. She had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape. The more she moved, the more the room seemed to shift, to stretch beyond the boundaries of her understanding. The floor beneath her feet felt unstable, like she was walking on the surface of a fragile illusion that could shatter at any moment. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't a hallucination. It couldn't be. But if it wasn't, then what was it? She reached out to touch the door again, driven by a force she couldn't explain, her fingers brushing against the carvings. The instant her skin made contact, the world seemed to freeze. The air itself seemed to constrict, and she felt an oppressive weight settle on her chest. "You shouldn't have come," the voice murmured, not through the air, but directly in her mind. "Now you are ours." The words echoed, ringing in her ears like a twisted melody. She could feel it, whatever it was, pressing against her thoughts, pushing against the walls of her mind, like a presence that had been there all along, waiting. A cold laugh followed the voice. It was soft at first, like a whisper, then louder, as though it were reverberating through the very walls of this dark space. Lena tried to scream, but her throat had gone dry. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She could only stand there, frozen, as the laughter grew louder and louder. Her vision blurred, and she could feel the edges of the world slipping away from her, distorting, as though she were no longer fully in control of her body. The darkness was alive, and it was coming for her. And the room was not empty. When Lena finally managed to blink, to shake off the overwhelming sense of paralysis, the scene before her had changed. The door was gone. In its place was a new structure, an ornate mirror, its surface cracked and smeared with what looked like blood. The glass was warped, bending inward as though reflecting a twisted version of the world around her. In the reflection, Lena saw not just her own face, but something else, someone else standing behind her. A figure, tall, shadowed. The face was obscured, but she could feel its presence, a malevolent force behind her, watching, waiting. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she turned sharply, expecting to find nothing there, but the space behind her was empty. The air was cold, still, the silence deafening, but the reflection remained. The figure was still there, staring at her with hollow eyes, its presence real despite the fact that nothing was physically present. Lena reached out for the mirror, her fingers trembling, and for a moment, she thought she might be able to touch it, to touch the reflection, to understand what was happening. But before her fingers could make contact, the reflection distorted. The figure behind her grew larger, its mouth opening wide, wider than any human mouth should, stretching impossibly, like some grotesque parody of a scream. And then, as if the world itself had decided to punish her, the mirror shattered. Fonzie Barrett's this chapter continues to build on Lena's descent into the unknown, creating a sense of escalating terror as she confronts the doors, the whispers, and the strange presence surrounding her. The atmosphere remains eerie, and her sense of reality begins to fracture, leaving her vulnerable to whatever malevolent force inhabits this space. The next steps would be to expand further into Lena's journey deeper into this ominous space, with increasing encounters with the mysterious forces at play. Chapter 2. The Whispering Darkness, continued. Lena's fingers twitched in the air, drawn instinctively toward the shattered mirror. She felt something, a strange pull, an almost magnetic force, as the shards scattered across the floor, their jagged edges gleaming like teeth in the dim flickering light. The reflection of the distorted figure still hung in her mind, its twisted mouth still open, its hollow gaze still fixed on her. The image was seared into her mind, a vision she couldn't shake off, no matter how hard she tried. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but the reality before her seemed to warp with each passing second. The mirror fragments, though shattered, still seemed to reflect her in impossible ways, twisting the light in strange, unnatural directions. It was as if the glass itself was trying to pull her back into it. She backed away, her steps unsteady, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The floor beneath her feet felt uneven now, as if she were walking on something soft, malleable, like quicksand. Her pulse quickened as her mind raced for an explanation, but there was nothing. Nothing but the cold, suffocating silence that stretched around her, consuming her thoughts. She needed to leave. She needed to get out. But every step she took only seemed to draw her further into this maddening space, deeper into the darkness that clawed at the edges of her mind. Her eyes darted around, desperate for some form of escape, but the space had transformed again. What had been solid walls before had dissolved into an endless void, a chasm that stretched infinitely in all directions. There were no doors, no windows, only darkness, except for the whispers. They were louder now, surrounding her from all sides, coiling around her thoughts like tendrils of smoke. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a chorus, a cacophony of voices, distorted, overlapping, their words unintelligible, but their presence undeniable. It felt as if the air itself was speaking to her, each word a cold, suffocating breath against her skin. "Come closer." The voice she had heard before cut through the noise, a low, gravelly whisper that sent chills down her spine. "You are ours, Lena, forever." Her breath caught in her throat as the room shifted again. The walls began to close in on her, slowly at first, and then faster, as if the very space she stood in was alive, constricting around her, forcing her into the center. The floor began to ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. The cracks in the stones spread like veins, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm, and Lena could feel the ground beneath her feet sinking, no, changing, as if the earth itself were transforming into something far more sinister. Panic surged through her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She could feel her heart pounding violently, almost painfully in her ribcage. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the more she denied it, the more real it became. Her senses betrayed her. The space, this nightmare, was all too tangible. It was suffocating. And then, from the center of the room, something else emerged. A shape, barely perceptible at first, began to coalesce in the darkness, emerging from the blackness like a shadow spilling from the depths of hell. It was tall, but not human. Its form was twisted, deformed, shifting in and out of shape, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Its edges blurred, as if it were made of smoke and shadow, its contours never settling, constantly in flux. The only thing Lena could make out clearly was its eyes. They were enormous, gleaming white in the dark, a pair of hollow orbs that reflected nothing but the emptiness around them. But they were fixed on her. They knew her. They recognized her. Lena's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She could feel it now, this presence, pushing against her, trying to invade her mind, to break through the walls she had built to keep it out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their words no longer a murmur but a guttural chant, a call to something ancient, something malevolent. It's too late for you, Lena. You can never leave. The figure moved closer, its form blurring and distorting, as though it were never meant to be seen. Every movement it made sent ripples through the air, like the surface of a pond disturbed by something unseen beneath. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, then snapped back, twisting in unnatural angles. Its mouth, if it even had one, opened wider, revealing rows of jagged, sharpened teeth, too many for a single mouth, each set of teeth mismatched, jagged, and serrated. It didn't speak with words anymore. It didn't need to. The very air around it seemed to bend and crackle with malevolence, suffocating Lena with a presence that was pure darkness, a living thing made of fear and despair. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared. Lena stood in the center of the room, her breath ragged, her legs trembling beneath her. The walls, the shadows, the whispering, they were all gone. The space around her was once again an empty void. She was alone. Alone, except for the crushing silence that pressed against her like a physical weight. It was deafening. It was suffocating. But she wasn't alone. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she felt it, a presence in the air just behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was there. She could feel its cold breath on the back of her neck, the oppressive weight of its gaze heavy upon her, even as the shadows remained still, unyielding. There was something else waiting for her. She didn't know how she knew it, but the realization hit her with the force of a lightning strike. The figure hadn't disappeared. It had merely retreated into the darkness. It was still there, watching her, and it would never leave. "It's too late for you, Lena," came the voice again, closer now, just behind her ear. Lena gasped, spinning around, but there was nothing, only the empty space. But then, the whisper came again, not from behind her, but from within her own mind. "You're not supposed to be here." Lena's chest tightened. The voice was inside her head, not in the air around her. It was coming from somewhere deep, somewhere buried in the depths of her consciousness. The space was alive, and it was no longer simply a place. It was becoming her. It was claiming her. Chapter 3. The Corridor of Lost Souls. Lena's feet faltered with every step she took, as if the floor beneath her were no longer solid, no longer real. Every inch of space felt unfamiliar, alien, a place that existed between the cracks of reality, a dimension where time had no meaning, and the air itself felt thick with invisible eyes watching her every move. It had been hours, perhaps days. It was impossible to tell anymore. The concept of time had become a forgotten memory in this forsaken place. The endless void around her offered no hints, no markers, nothing to guide her. It was as if she had been swallowed by a great black hole, leaving her floating in an eternal, oppressive nothingness. Lena's breath came out in shallow gasps as her body trembled from both the cold and fear. She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, hoping to find some warmth, some comfort. But there was nothing. She could feel the darkness pressing in from every direction. It was alive. It was suffocating. Her thoughts began to fragment, each one slipping further and further into chaos, swallowed up by the oppressive silence. She tried to remember how she got here, tried to grasp onto some semblance of reason, but each attempt only seemed to spiral her deeper into the madness that surrounded her. The darkness was not just a lack of light. It was a presence, a living entity, one that seemed to feed on her fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. And the whispers. Oh, the whispers. They never stopped. They had started out soft at first, like a distant murmur. But now they were louder, clearer, more insistent. Sometimes they sounded like 1,000 voices, overlapping each other, their words incomprehensible. Other times, the whispers came in fragments, broken, fragmented sentences that seemed to be speaking directly to her. You don't belong here. You're running out of time. We see you. Lena clutched her head in her hands, trying to block out the maddening voices, but they were always there, crawling into her ears, slithering beneath her skin. They followed her every move, whispering in her mind like a terrible lullaby. Every corner she turned, every path she took led her deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of this nightmare. There was no escape. As her feet carried her down another corridor, narrow, dark, and claustrophobic, she felt a shift in the atmosphere. The air grew heavier, thicker, as though something unseen was moving just beyond her reach. The walls seemed to pulse, breathing in time with her heartbeat. Lena's pulse quickened in response, and she tried to steady her breath, but her body betrayed her. Fear gripped her chest, and her vision blurred. Something was coming. A shadow flickered at the edge of her sight. She froze. It was like a ripple across the fabric of reality itself, an anomaly, a distortion in the darkness. The air shifted with a sudden chill, and Lena felt a sharp, crawling sensation slither up her spine. Not again, she whispered, but her voice came out as a hoarse rasp, barely audible over the overwhelming silence. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, like a chorus of tortured souls pleading for release. The walls began to twist, their surfaces warping into grotesque shapes. The floors beneath her feet seemed to buckle and shift, as if they were made of something organic, something alive, writhing beneath her weight. And then, a figure appeared in front of her. At first it was barely perceptible, like a smear in the dark, nothing more than a shadow among shadows. But as it slowly coalesced, Lena's breath caught in her throat. It was tall, impossibly tall, its silhouette stretching unnaturally high, towering over her. Its form was vague, blurred at the edges, but what struck her most were its eyes. They were glowing faintly, a pale, sickly yellow, piercing the darkness like twin lanterns in the abyss. It didn't move, but Lena could feel it. She could feel its presence, its gaze fixed upon her, suffocating her, pulling at her very soul. You shouldn't have come, a voice echoed in her mind, low and guttural. Lena staggered back, her heart hammering in her chest. Her mind screamed for her to run, to flee, but her body refused to obey. Her feet felt like lead, anchored to the spot, as though the floor itself were reaching up to hold her in place. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The air grew thick with an unnatural weight, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The figure, if it could even be called that, was not human. Its body was a grotesque amalgamation of twisted limbs and formless shapes, constantly shifting and contorting, never settling into any recognizable form. It was as if it was not bound by the laws of nature, not constrained by the physical realm. Lena's vision blurred as the figure stepped closer, its shape warping with every movement, an incomprehensible swirl of darkness and light. "You're trapped," it whispered, the words sliding into her mind like cold knives. "There's no way out. Not for you. Not anymore." Lena stumbled backward, her heart racing. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, I have to get out of here." But the figure's eyes bore into her, unblinking, unwavering. The silence around them deepened, stretching into a terrible eternity. She could feel her sanity slipping, like sand through her fingers. The darkness was closing in, wrapping around her like a vice, and the whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else. "We will never let you go." She shut her eyes, trying to block out the voice, trying to block out the feeling of the air pressing in on her. But when she opened them again, the figure was gone. The room, the corridor, the entire space, it had all shifted again. The walls no longer pulsated. The air was still, but it was colder now. Lena could see nothing but an endless stretch of blackness, as if the corridor itself had turned into an infinite void. She could still feel the weight of the presence, though. It lingered, like a shadow cast over her very soul. It's not real. None of this is real, Lena thought desperately, clutching her head, trying to hold on to whatever shreds of sanity she had left. But her mind betrayed her. The whispers, the voices, the cold. They weren't going anywhere. It's all real. She could feel it then, the growing certainty. She was not in some dream. This was not some nightmare. This place, this space, it was real. A reality in which she was trapped, her every step weighed down by the dark forces that sought to claim her, and the darkness was closing in. Lena didn't know how much longer she could last. She couldn't tell if her mind was unraveling, or if the world around her was collapsing, but the terror was real, palpable. The voices, the shifting walls, the things that lived in the dark, just beyond the edge of her perception, they were all watching her, waiting for her, and she would never leave. Chapter 3. The Corridor of Lost Souls continued. Lena's heart hammered in her chest, her mind spinning wildly. She stood frozen in the midst of the pitch-black corridor, her eyes scanning the void around her. Every inch of this place felt wrong. It wasn't just the shadows that refused to settle, but the very essence of the air, thick with unease, alive with an almost palpable dread. The whispers hadn't stopped. They came in fragments now, unintelligible but laced with a malevolence that sank into her skin. The voice of the dark, calling to her, claiming her sanity piece by piece. Her legs trembled beneath her as if they too feared to move forward. And yet, the compulsion to press on was undeniable. What choice did she have? To stand still was to surrender, to let the darkness consume her, body and soul. There was only one direction left to go, even if that meant walking deeper into the heart of this living nightmare. With a shuddering breath, Lena pushed forward. The ground felt uneven beneath her, as though the floor itself was alive, shifting in small, almost imperceptible movements. Every step she took was met with a sense of foreboding, as though the very air in front of her was alive, watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her in an indistinct cacophony of voices. But then, like a knife slicing through the haze, a clear voice cut through the confusion, and it sent a cold chill straight to her spine. "Turn around!" Lena froze, her pulse skyrocketing. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It was the same voice she had heard when she first stepped into the corridor. The one that had whispered the words, "You don't belong here." But now, it was sharper, more insistent, and it was coming from somewhere behind her. A chill ran through her veins, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Lena felt a pang of true terror. She couldn't bring herself to turn around. Something in her knew that if she did, it would be worse than anything she could imagine. The darkness stretched behind her like an endless pit, but even that wasn't what terrified her the most. It was the feeling, the certainty, that something was waiting in that darkness, just out of sight. "You have to turn around," the voice demanded, its tone urgent, full of malice, "before it's too late." The whispering intensified. Lena felt the pressure in the air increase, as if the very atmosphere was suffocating her. Every inch of her body screamed for her to run, to flee from the unseen horror behind her. But her legs remained locked in place, her mind spinning in circles, trapped in a nightmarish loop. "It's coming." The words were barely a whisper now, crawling into her ears like insects, burrowing deep into her skull. Lena swallowed hard, the dry sensation in her throat only adding to the suffocating sense of dread that gripped her. And then she heard it. A sound so faint at first that she thought it was just a trick of her mind. A low scraping noise, like nails dragging across stone. It grew louder with each passing second, like something, or someone, was slowly, deliberately moving toward her. The darkness in front of her began to shift. At first it was a small ripple, barely noticeable. But then it grew, widening, like the veil of night was being pulled back to reveal something. Something that should never have been seen. A shape emerged from the shadows. Lena gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs elongated, its body twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. Its face was obscured, hidden behind a mask of blackness, a face that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as though it was not quite solid. Every time she blinked, the figure seemed to shift position, to change its shape, as if it existed in multiple places at once. The scraping sound grew louder. The thing was coming closer. Its movement was slow, deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat that matched the rhythm of the thing's advance. She wanted to run, she wanted to scream, but her body was frozen, held captive by some force stronger than fear, stronger than reason. The figure stopped in front of her, just out of reach, but close enough that Lena could feel its presence pressing against her skin. The air seemed to grow even colder, the temperature dropping with a suddenness that made her skin crawl. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice spoke again, and this time it wasn't just in her head. It was coming from the figure. It echoed in her ears, a sound that reverberated deep in her bones, vibrating in the very marrow of her spine. Lena wanted to look away. She wanted to escape. But her eyes were locked on the figure, drawn to it by some irresistible force. The mask of darkness that hid its face seemed to ripple and twitch, like it was trying to reveal something underneath. But there was nothing beneath the mask. No face, no features. Just an endless void. A yawning chasm of nothingness. Lena's breath came faster now, panicking, her body screaming for release. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The figure's presence was suffocating, drowning her in its sheer malevolence. Then it moved again, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, reaching out toward her. Lena stumbled back, her hands held up in front of her as if she could stop it with just a gesture. But the figure's fingers, long and skeletal, were already there. They brushed her skin, icy cold, sending a shock of terror through her body. "You're not meant to leave," it whispered. The words were like a death sentence. Lena's entire body trembled as the world around her seemed to warp, the air vibrating with an unnatural hum. Her vision blurred, her mind clouded with 1,000 swirling thoughts, none of them making sense. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't move. The darkness was pulling her in, swallowing her whole. And then, with a force she couldn't comprehend, she was yanked forward, falling into the void that had opened up beneath her feet. The darkness consumed her, wrapping around her body, pulling her deeper, deeper into the unknown. Her screams were swallowed by the emptiness. And then, silence. Chapter 4. The veil unraveled. Lena's mind was spinning, her body weightless as she fell deeper into the abyss. The darkness engulfed her, pressing against her skin like 1,000 cold fingers. She could no longer hear her own breath, the world around her muffling everything. Sound, sight, and time itself. The sensation was both suffocating and liberating, as if she had been swallowed whole by the void. She didn't know how long she fell. Minutes, hours, maybe days. The air felt thick, like it was closing in on her, wrapping itself around her chest, compressing the very space she occupied. Her thoughts were a blur, slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. Was she even still alive? Was this the end? No answers came. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the falling stopped. Lena slammed into the ground, the impact jarring her to her core. Her breath rushed out of her lungs in a sharp gasp, and she lay there for a moment, disoriented, her heart racing. The world around her was no longer dark. It was a suffocating grey, a colourless realm where shadows twisted unnaturally, shifting in and out of view like fleeting nightmares. The air was dense, thick with something malevolent, something that gnawed at her mind, clawing at her sanity. Lena scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling as she pushed herself upright. Her surroundings were foreign, yet eerily familiar. The walls were covered in a slick, wet sheen, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. The air was damp, and every breath she took was heavy with the stench of decay. It felt wrong. This place, this feeling of dread that crawled under her skin. She had crossed into something far darker than any nightmare she had ever imagined. Behind her, she heard the soft scrape of something moving across the ground. A shiver ran down her spine as she spun around, her eyes desperately searching the shadows for any sign of what followed her. But there was nothing. The space around her seemed endless, the shadows playing tricks on her mind. She reached for the walls to steady herself, her fingers brushing against the cold, slimy surface. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she slowly moved forward, each step bringing a deeper sense of unease. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice whispered, its words hanging in the air like a ghostly echo. Lena froze. Her heart skipped a beat, her body going rigid. The voice, it was familiar, but distorted, twisted into something unrecognizable. It sent a wave of nausea through her. "What? What is this place?" Lena whispered into the dark, her voice trembling. The response came in a soft, mocking laugh, low and hollow, as if coming from the very walls themselves. "You already know." The words sunk into her like poison. Her mind raced to piece together the fragments of reality she had left, but the more she thought, the more it slipped away from her grasp. It was as if the place itself was erasing her thoughts, replacing them with an overwhelming, insatiable fear. Lena took a step forward, her feet dragging across the wet, slimy floor. Her eyes darted around the cavernous space, trying to make sense of the madness. It was as if the walls were shifting, warping in and out of focus, distorting everything she saw. The shapes in the shadows seemed to move on their own, bending and twisting as if alive. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice repeated, louder now, an almost primal force behind it. "There are doors, and they open for you. But once you step through, there's no turning back." Lena's pulse quickened. Doors. Her mind grasped at the word like a lifeline. She had to find them, had to get out of here, or at least find something that could give her an answer. Any answer. She couldn't stay in this place. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the dark room. The shadows, so thick that they seemed to move on their own, parted for just a moment, revealing a faint glow in the distance, a dull light that beckoned her forward. With hesitant steps, Lena moved toward it, her body on edge, her senses on high alert. Each step she took felt like an eternity, each movement a fight against the crushing weight of the air, which seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. As she neared the light, she realized it wasn't a light at all, but a door. It stood tall and looming, framed by thick shadows that seemed to pulse with life. The wood was warped and cracked, as though it had been here far longer than anything in this twisted world should have. Her hand reached out to touch the door, the surface cold and unyielding under her fingertips. It was as if the door itself was breathing, alive with some force beyond her comprehension. The edges of the door seemed to shimmer, as if it were a fragile boundary between two worlds, one that had been broken open by her presence. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was now a rasp, a growl. Lena recoiled as she stepped back from the door, her heart racing. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It had become something far darker, far more terrifying. She could hear something scraping on the other side of the door, something moving, something watching her. She had to make a choice. The moment stretched on, suspended in time, as Lena weighed her options. Behind her, the dark void stretched endlessly, an abyss that seemed to pull at her soul. In front of her, the door. The door that might offer escape. Or perhaps it was the thing that had brought her here in the first place. Was there any way out? Was there any way to escape the thing that had been following her since the moment she entered this forsaken place? With trembling hands, Lena grasped the cold, weathered handle of the door and twisted. The mechanism clicked, sending a shock of fear through her. The door swung open slowly, creaking on its hinges, revealing nothing but the deepest, blackest void imaginable. The very air seemed to warp around it, pulling her toward it like a force of nature. "Do not enter." The voice, now more insistent, more desperate, roared from all directions, but it was too late. Lena stepped through the door. Chapter 5. The Fractured Echo. Lena's scream reverberated through the hall of mirrors, but it was swallowed by the void. No answer, no release. It felt as though the very air had been consumed by the shadows that now wrapped around her, tightening like a vice. Her heart hammered in her chest as the darkness pulled her inexorably toward the mirror. The cold, slick floor beneath her hands felt alive, pulsing with a strange, otherworldly energy. But her limbs refused to obey. She could barely breathe, let alone fight. The mirror was so close now. Her distorted reflection grinned back at her, the smile not one of fear but of cold malice. The eyes, her eyes, glowed black, empty sockets that seemed to devour all light. They were no longer hers. They were something else, something ancient, something hungry. Her reflection raised a hand slowly, as though mocking her every movement. The fingers curled into a twisted, grotesque shape, pointing at her as if it were making an accusation. Lena gasped, her fingers clawing against the smooth surface of the floor, desperate to push herself away, to free herself from this nightmare. But the shadows, they weren't just around her, they were inside her, suffocating her very soul. "You can't escape," the reflection whispered, its voice cold and hollow, as if it came from the depths of the earth. It echoed in her mind, a distorted version of her own voice, but broken, fractured. "Not from this place. Not from yourself." Lena's blood ran cold. The words were a direct hit to her psyche, gnawing at the corners of her sanity. She wanted to scream again, to tear herself away from this hell, but her throat was tight, strangled by invisible hands. For a moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her own pulse, deafening in the stillness. She had to focus. She had to find a way to break free from this oppressive, suffocating force. Think. Just think, Lena, think. The shadows continued to pull at her legs, tightening their grip, like hands reaching from the depths of the earth, dragging her down into the abyss. She couldn't let them win. She couldn't let this world devour her. "Lena!" The voice came again, a low whisper, but this time it was different. This time it didn't feel like her reflection speaking. It felt like someone, or something, else. Something older, something ancient. The walls of the mirror hallway seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her heartbeat. The glass around her shimmered, rippling as though the surface was alive. Lena blinked, her vision swimming. But there was something else now. Something just beyond her reach. A glimpse of movement, a flicker of light that wasn't a reflection. "You have to let go," the voice said again. But this time it was a promise, not an accusation. "You have to accept the truth." Lena fought to stand, her legs shaking violently as she forced herself to her feet, her fingers scraping against the walls for leverage. She refused to succumb to whatever this place was trying to make her believe. She couldn't. The reflection in the mirror changed again. This time, it wasn't just her face staring back at her. It was her, or, at least, it looked like her. She took a step backward, her breath shallow. The figure in the mirror was closer now, moving toward her, its body somehow not bound by the same rules as hers. The reflection was moving with unnatural grace, as though the fabric of reality itself bent and twisted to allow it to move in ways she couldn't. "You're trapped, Lena," the reflection spoke, its voice now a low, guttural growl. "You've always been trapped." The air around her seemed to shudder, as if the mirrors were themselves alive, feeding off the fear that ran through her veins. She felt it, deep within her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. The darkness here wasn't just physical, it was psychological, a nightmare that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of her being. Lena shook her head furiously, trying to silence the voice that echoed in her skull. No, I'm not trapped. I'll find a way out. A cold, slimy tendril shot from one of the mirrors, wrapping itself around her ankle like a snake. It burned where it touched her skin, sending shocks of cold panic up her spine. She screamed in pain, falling to her knees as more tendrils slithered from the mirrors, wrapping around her body, pulling her toward the glass. Her vision blurred, but she could feel them. Them, The shadows. They were everywhere now, crawling from every crack, every crevice, from every reflection. The mirrors were no longer just windows into her fear, they were gateways. "It's too late," the voice whispered. "You are already part of this place. You always have been." Lena fought against the grip of the shadows, but they only tightened. Her fingers dug into the floor, nails scraping against the cold, unyielding surface. She couldn't escape them, couldn't outrun them. Every time she tried, they would drag her back, the dark tendrils growing stronger with each movement she made. She had to think. She had to find a way to fight back. Then, something broke through the haze of fear, a flash of memory. "The door," she whispered, a single word cutting through the panic that clouded her thoughts. "The door! I have to find the door!" In a sudden, frantic burst of energy, Lena yanked her foot free from the tendrils, pushing herself toward the far end of the hall. She didn't know where the door was. She didn't know if it would even exist anymore, but she had to try. She had no choice. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest, each step taking her deeper into the maze of mirrors. She could feel the shadows creeping up on her again, could feel the cold tendrils wrapping around her, but she kept moving. She could hear them whispering in the corners of her mind, pulling at her thoughts, dragging her down. They wanted her to surrender, but Lena couldn't, not yet, not while there was still a flicker of hope left. The hallway seemed endless, the reflections stretching on forever, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Then she saw it, a door, a real door. It stood at the far end of the hall, just beyond the range of the mirrors. Lena's pulse quickened and she surged forward, her limbs heavy with exhaustion, but fueled by sheer desperation. She had to reach it, had to escape, but as she neared the door, a terrible realization dawned on her. The door was wrong. It wasn't like the other doors she had seen, the one that led her here. This one was different. There was something wrong about it, something that felt wrong. The edges were jagged, the wood warped and decaying. It looked as though it had been here for centuries, ancient and broken, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Lena hesitated. A voice, her voice, whispered from the shadows, "Don't open it. Don't let it take you." But it was too late. The door was already calling her. Chapter 6. The door's hollow call. The door loomed before Lena, jagged and weathered, the very edges of its wood seeming to bleed into the darkness. She felt a strange pull towards it, an invisible force drawing her in, its call as faint as a whisper and as loud as a scream. Each step she took was heavier than the last, her limbs stiff and reluctant, but her mind screamed at her to move, to escape. She had to reach the door. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached it. The air was colder now, colder than it had been before, as if the door itself were a cold void sucking all the warmth from the world around her. As she reached for the handle, a low groan reverberated through the hall, and for the briefest of moments, the mirrors around her flickered, showing something, someone, moving in the glass. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Lena's heart raced as her hand hovered over the door's rusted handle. Something was off. The smell, a strange odor like damp earth and rotting wood, mixed with a metallic tang. She wanted to step back, to turn around and run, but the shadows behind her pressed closer. The tendrils, once silent, were now whispering to her, urging her to leave. "Don't open it. Don't listen to it." But it was too late. Her fingers wrapped around the handle and turned it with a soft click, the sound so loud it felt like it was echoing throughout her very soul. The door creaked open slowly, the darkness beyond it deeper than the night itself. "Welcome back," a voice whispered in the depths of the doorway. It wasn't her own voice. It wasn't even a voice she recognized. It was ancient, guttural, an echo of something that had been waiting for her. The moment she stepped through the threshold, a wave of icy cold hit her like a slap to the face. It wasn't just physical. It was a chill that seeped into her bones, settling deep within her very essence. Lena stepped forward, unable to resist, her body moving of its own accord. The door closed behind her with a soft, deliberate thud, sealing her into whatever this place was. The shadows seemed to hum with a dark, living energy, like the beating of a heart. The air here was thick, almost suffocating, and the walls pulsed with a life of their own. She turned around quickly, her pulse thumping in her ears. But the door was gone. There was no sign of it, only an endless, featureless black void stretching before her. "What is this place?" she whispered to herself. But the answer came not from the air around her, but from the depths of her mind. "It's where it began, where it all ends." The words echoed in her skull, familiar and yet not her own. They felt like an invasion, like something from the darkness had taken root inside her, whispering truths she wasn't ready to hear. Her breath caught as she looked ahead. In the distance, something moved. At first, it was just a shadow, but as it drew closer, she could make out its form. A figure walking towards her. It was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long, bending in ways that should have been impossible. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but its presence, its wrongness, was enough to make her blood freeze. The figure reached out to her, its fingers long and sharp. Too long, too sharp, like the branches of a tree twisted by time. And then it spoke. "We've been waiting for you, Lena." The voice was low, almost a growl, yet strangely familiar. It was a voice she had heard before, soft, comforting, almost like a lullaby. A voice that carried both danger and promise. Lena stepped back, her hand reaching for the air as if to push the figure away, but her body betrayed her. She couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the ground, her body frozen in place, as if the very shadows around her had seized her. The figure stepped closer, its face slowly emerging from the darkness. She could feel the air around her grow heavier, as though the very weight of her own thoughts was pressing down upon her. The face that emerged from the shadow was hers. "You're here," the figure said, its lips curling into a twisted, knowing smile. "You never left. We never left." Lena's heart stopped in her chest as the realization dawned on her. This wasn't just some reflection of her. This was her. It was the part of her that had been lost. The piece of herself she had buried deep inside. The side she had tried to outrun for so long. It had never left. It had always been here, waiting, hiding in the mirrors, in the shadows. And now, it was speaking. "Who are you?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling as she tried to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. The figure cocked its head, its smile widening. "Who am I? Who are you? Is it so simple? Can you answer that?" The figure stepped forward again, reaching out with its hand. "It's time to stop running, Lena. It's time to embrace what you are." Lena felt her throat tighten as the figure's hand touched her cheek. A cold, dead touch. The kind that numbed the soul. The kind that twisted her insides. Her skin tingled in horror, her heart pounding. "No." She pulled away, stumbling backward, her breath ragged. "I'm not you. I'm not this." The figure laughed, the sound hollow and echoing, reverberating in the dark space around her. "You are. You always were. You just needed to remember." Lena's hands trembled as she fought to push the figure away. But its grip was iron, unyielding, its cold fingers biting into her skin. She had no choice. She was trapped. Her own reflection was holding her captive. The mirror of her soul finally coming to life, fully manifesting in front of her. "Let go." The voice echoed through her mind again, the whisper that had been there all along, the voice of the door, the voice of the shadows. "Let go of the fear, Lena. You're not running anymore." A wave of despair washed over her, overwhelming her senses. She couldn't escape this. She couldn't escape herself. "No," Lena whispered again, barely able to form the words. She was shaking, the world spinning around her, her thoughts crashing into one another. But the figure's smile only widened. "It's already too late." And with that, Lena felt the shadows around her close in, like a blanket smothering her, like they were absorbing her very essence. The darkness consumed her whole, her body, her mind, her soul, until all that was left was the sound of the shadows whispering, "You were never meant to leave." Chapter 7. The Echo of Silence. Lena's mind was a battlefield, her thoughts torn between the cold truth of her surroundings and the crushing weight of what was about to happen. The moment the shadows closed in, they had whispered something. No, someone had whispered something familiar. The whispers weren't new, though. They'd been there all along, haunting her from the very first door she'd passed through. She remembered the smell of the air when she'd first entered this place, thick with the scent of decay and dampness, like an old tomb. Now it was different. It felt alive, the air moving with an energy that seemed almost watchful. The world around her was no longer the endless void she had first encountered. There were now faint outlines, barely perceptible, like shadows of forgotten memories. The floor beneath her feet seemed to pulse in rhythm with the whispers, an undulating rhythm like a beating heart. It was unnerving, but it didn't stop her from walking. She moved slowly, her footsteps hesitant and echoing loudly in the vast emptiness. The stillness of the air was suffocating, the silence heavier than she had ever felt. Each step was a reminder that this place wasn't merely another layer of reality. It was something that had existed before time, something older than the concept of life itself. And then, a sound, sharp and cold, cut through the silence, as though the very walls themselves had grown tired of the quiet. A door. Another door. Lena didn't remember seeing it before. It was there, just ahead, carved from what seemed to be obsidian, with intricate markings that danced across its surface like symbols of an ancient language. The markings were pulsating faintly, glowing with an otherworldly light. Something about it called to her. No, not again. Lena had learned better by now. She knew that entering through these doors meant entering a new world. A world where the rules didn't apply, where there was no way to predict what waited on the other side. The door beckoned, an invitation she knew all too well. But something was different. As she stared at the door, she felt the chilling sense that this was the last one, the final door. She could feel its power, its ancient pull. The voices from before were silent now, as though the place had grown bored of her struggles. "It's time," a voice whispered inside her mind. It was the same voice that had whispered when she first entered this place. The voice of the door, but now it had changed. There was an edge to it, something sharp, like a blade ready to cut. The ground shifted beneath her feet, the pulsating rhythm intensifying, matching the beat of her heart. Each thud seemed to echo louder, vibrating through her chest. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Her limbs grew heavy, weighed down by an invisible force, but she refused to let herself be paralyzed by it. This time, she would open the door, whether it was her choice or not. She took a step forward, and another. Her fingers trembled as she reached out for the obsidian handle. It was cold, colder than the room, colder than anything she had ever felt. She could see her reflection in the door's surface. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, yet they were empty, as though drained of emotion, as if someone else had taken over. She gritted her teeth, pushed forward and turned the handle. The door opened with a groan, far louder than before, as though the very hinges themselves were protesting against its release. A cold gust of wind rushed out, carrying with it the scent of old earth, like something buried deep beneath the ground. The darkness beyond the door was thick, a shadow so complete that it seemed to swallow the light. The threshold seemed to stretch before her like an abyss. "Come in, Lena." The voice was soft, seductive. It wrapped itself around her like a thick fog, urging her into the unknown. The whisper was so familiar, but it wasn't hers. She had heard it before, many times in the places she had visited, but this time there was no hesitation, no fear, only the overwhelming urge to step in. She stepped across the threshold. Immediately, the air shifted. The walls closed in, the darkness becoming even more oppressive, squeezing the breath from her lungs. Her heartbeat hammered in her chest, louder now, but it was no longer her own. It was the world's heartbeat, beating in unison with her. The space around her was no longer void. It was alive. The walls were moving, slowly, as though breathing. She could feel them pressing against her, crushing her from all sides. And yet there was no escape, no way to run. In the darkness, a figure moved. A shadow. No face. Just the outline of something wrong. The figure moved closer, its presence filling the air with dread. The whispers grew louder. "You know who I am." The figure stopped in front of her, the darkness still thick around it, its features hidden. But then, slowly, the shadows receded, and Lena saw the face. It was hers. But it wasn't right. The reflection of her face in the darkness was twisted, like a mirror shattered and pieced together again. Her features were distorted, her eyes hollow and black, as though they had been drained of all light. Her mouth was stretched wide into a grotesque smile that made her want to scream, but she couldn't. She couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The figure raised its hand. Lena's body followed the movement, as though she were no longer in control, her arm extended before her, as if inviting the figure to touch her. But no, she couldn't. "You were always meant to come here," the figure said. Its voice was cold, filled with ancient knowledge, the knowledge of everything. It was the voice of the door, the voice of the place, the voice of the shadow. Lena wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her. She was frozen, her mind locked in a cage of terror, her body betraying her at every turn. The figure reached for her, its hand stretching unnaturally long, its fingers curling around her wrist with a grip that sent waves of pain through her. She wanted to pull away, but there was no force strong enough to break free. "This is the end, Lena," it whispered, its voice too close to her ear. "There is no escape." The world around her began to pulse again, the darkness moving, breathing, wrapping around her like a living thing. And then, with one final breath, Lena felt herself fall, not downwards, but into the blackness, into a void that seemed to stretch on forever, a void that was not empty, but full of memories, of everything that had led her here. Her mind screamed, but there was no sound. Her body writhed, but there was no release. She was lost to the darkness, to the door, to the shadows. And then, the world went still. Chapter 8. The Hollow Realm. The silence hung like an oppressive weight in the air, thick and unyielding. Lena's breath came in shallow gasps, the air she inhaled bitter and cold, as though it had been trapped for centuries in this place. She stood in the center of a vast, cavernous chamber that stretched out before her in a darkness so absolute, it felt as though the world itself had been swallowed whole. The ground beneath her was slick with moisture, the uneven surface groaning under her weight. Each step she took was muffled, as though the floor were a sponge absorbing the very essence of sound. There was no echo here, no trace of life, no sign of existence beyond her own hollow presence. A sense of dread gripped her chest, tightening with every heartbeat. She wasn't alone. She knew she wasn't. The whispers that had followed her since the moment she had entered this cursed space were growing louder now, more distinct, rising from the shadows like tendrils of smoke curling around her. She turned in every direction, but saw nothing. The darkness was a wall, a suffocating veil that pressed in from all sides. It was inescapable, as though the very fabric of reality had bent to the will of the void. She could feel eyes watching her, hundreds of eyes, all concealed within the blackness, their gaze a heavy weight that bore down on her. She had tried to ignore the whispers, tried to shut out the growing madness in her mind. But it was impossible now. They were too loud, too insistent. They were calling to her. "Lena!" The voice was a low, seductive murmur, as familiar as her own thoughts but far colder. It slid into her mind like a snake, hissing, its tone dripping with malice. She froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't just the voice of the shadows. It was her voice, the one that had been echoing in her mind from the very start. It was the voice that had guided her down this path of torment, the voice that had lured her into the realm of the forgotten doors. "Lena, you've always known. You've always known that there is no way out." The words stung, wrapping around her like chains, pulling tighter with every breath she took. She stumbled back, the cold walls pressing in, squeezing the air from her lungs. The floor was unyielding beneath her feet, and the whispers became a chorus, chanting her name over and over again. It was as though the room itself had come alive, each whisper emanating from the walls, the very air itself bending and shifting to their will. "No," she whispered, barely able to find her voice. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound, trying to remember who she was, who she had been. But the memories were slipping away. like sand through her fingers. Each thought that tried to surface was dragged back into the depths of her mind, swallowed by the suffocating darkness. She didn't know where she was anymore, or what had become of her. She had entered this place a woman, but now she was something else, something wrong. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. They no longer called her name but demanded her attention, clawing at her sanity. Her head ached, as if her skull were about to split open, the pressure building with each passing second. She could feel it now. Something in the room was changing, something shifting beneath the surface of her reality. The walls were no longer still, no longer just a silent, lifeless shell. They were alive. She reached out with trembling fingers, brushing against the cold stone, and the moment she made contact, the air around her rippled. The world seemed to warp, twisting and bending in unnatural ways. The floor trembled beneath her feet, and the walls began to move, slowly at first, but then faster, their edges warping, distorting, stretching like a grotesque reflection in a funhouse mirror. Lena stumbled back, gasping for breath, her pulse racing in terror. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. In the distance, a faint light flickered, like a dying ember, casting long shadows across the room. It was distant, but it beckoned her, drawing her closer with an irresistible pull. She fought the urge to go toward it, but the darkness around her seemed to conspire against her. It was closing in, pressing her toward the light, forcing her to move. With each step she took, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though they were urging her to reach it, to touch it, to embrace whatever lay beyond it. When she reached the light, she found herself standing before a door. But this door was different from the others. This one was alive. Its surface was not smooth or cold, but writhing, its shape ever-changing, as if it were made of something fluid, something sentient. The light around it pulsed with a sickly greenish hue, casting an unnatural glow on the walls. The symbols carved into the wood, no, into the flesh of the door, seemed to move, to shift and twist as though they were not static, but living, reacting to her presence. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "No, I won't." But before she could finish the thought, her hand was already reaching out, drawn toward the door as if it had a will of its own. She had no control. It was as though the door had taken possession of her, as though it had always been part of her. She didn't want to touch it, didn't want to open it, but her body betrayed her. Her fingers closed around the pulsating handle, and in that moment, she knew that whatever was beyond this door would not be her salvation, it would be her damnation. With a deep breath, she turned the handle. The door creaked open slowly, its hinges groaning like the last breath of a dying creature. The world beyond the door was shrouded in thick, impenetrable fog, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. She stepped through, her heart racing, her mind screaming for her to turn back, but the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in this new nightmare. And then she saw it. The figures, they were all around her, standing in the fog, their outlines barely visible in the swirling mist. They were humanoid, but distorted, their bodies twisted and malformed, their faces blank slates, devoid of features. They were silent, motionless, watching her with their empty eyes, their very presence suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to run, but the fog held her in place, like a vice around her chest. "You've come," one of them whispered, its voice a hollow echo that seemed to come from all directions at once. Lena's breath hitched in her throat as she realized it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, a cacophony of whispers that surrounded her, suffocating her, dragging her deeper into the darkness. The figures began to move, slowly at first, then faster, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes whose strings had been pulled too tightly. "No," Lena whispered, her knees giving out as she collapsed onto the cold, damp ground. "Please, stop. I don't want to be here. I just want to leave." But the figures didn't stop. They closed in around her, their faces still empty, still blank, but their movements now synchronized, as if they were a single vast entity. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her ears with a maddening buzz. "You can never leave. they all whispered in unison. And as the fog closed in around her, Lena knew, with a sickening certainty, that she was not merely lost in this place. She was trapped forever, a part of this realm, a part of the door, a part of whatever it was that had drawn her in, and there was no escaping it. Chapter 9. The Silent Watchers. Lena's breath was shallow, her chest heaving with panic as the fog thickened around her. She could no longer see the figures, only feel them, their presence pressing in on her like 1,000 invisible hands. The cold, clammy air seemed to freeze her to the spot, her limbs refusing to move. Her heart hammered in her chest, and the whispers were growing louder, more frantic, seeping into her thoughts like an insidious poison. You can never leave. The words echoed in her mind, a constant refrain that drove her to the edge of madness. She shut her eyes, willing herself to wake up, to escape this nightmare. But no matter how hard she tried, she knew this was not a dream. This was reality, or at least something that resembled it. The figures were real, the fog was real, and the door was still there, the one that had led her into this suffocating place. When she opened her eyes again, the figures were closer, too close. Their faces, if they could even be called faces, were distorted, featureless slabs of pale flesh, like mannequins with their expressions erased. Their bodies were twisted and asymmetrical, limbs bending in ways that were not natural, their movements slow and deliberate. Lena's heart skipped a beat as one of them reached out, its skeletal hand extending toward her with an unnatural jerky motion. "Don't touch me!" She wanted to scream, to fight back, but her body betrayed her. Her legs were frozen in place, as though they were no longer hers to control. The air was thick with an unbearable weight, and the walls of fog pressed in on her from all sides. She was suffocating, trapped, and it wasn't just the physical sense of confinement. It was deeper than that, a sense that she was bound by something far worse than just the fog or the figures. It was as if she had crossed into another realm, a space outside of time, and now she was a part of it, a part of whatever twisted force governed this place. There was no escape, no way back. Another figure lurched forward, its face empty and hollow. Lena felt her breath catch in her throat as it spoke. "You are ours now." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they carried an unmistakable finality. Lena's pulse raced, and her body trembled violently. The hand that reached for her felt like ice, cold and unyielding. She tried to pull away, but it was no use. She was locked in place, her body an unwilling vessel to whatever horrors these creatures had planned for her. And then, something worse happened. The fog began to move. At first, it was subtle, just a gentle stirring of the mist, as if it were being swept by an unseen wind. But then, it grew more violent. The air became thick with whispers, hissing, shrieking, like 1,000 voices all clamoring for attention, all speaking at once. Lena's vision blurred as the fog seemed to swallow her whole, pulling her deeper into its heart. She could no longer tell where the fog ended and the figures began. It was all the same now. A mass of twisting shadows, figures with limbs that bent in impossible angles, faces that twisted into grotesque shapes, and eyes, hundreds of eyes that stared at her, burning into her soul. There was nowhere to run, no door to escape through, no way out. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that twisted and tore at her mind. Each voice was distinct, but they all shared the same chilling message. "You belong to us now." Lena shook her head, her fingers gripping the cold earth beneath her. Her skin was slick with sweat, her throat dry as dust. Her mind screamed, desperate to break free, to wake up from this nightmare. But there was no waking, there was no escape. She was trapped in this place, this realm, forever. And then, just as she thought she might go mad from the voices, from the suffocating fog, something changed. The mist began to clear. Slowly, it parted like a curtain being drawn back, revealing the figures once more. But this time, there was something different about them. They were no longer moving. They stood perfectly still, like statues, their empty eyes fixed on her. It was as though time itself had stopped, and the entire world had gone silent. Lena's breath caught in her throat as a new presence made itself known. A figure stood before her, taller than the others, its outline bathed in an eerie, pale glow. Unlike the others, it wasn't distorted, wasn't twisted by some unnatural force. Its body was human, tall and gaunt, with pale skin that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its eyes, however, were not hollow like the others. They were alive, full of malice, filled with a hatred so deep that Lena could feel it in her bones. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if examining her. A soft smile spread across its lips, a smile that didn't reach its eyes. "You're finally here," it whispered, its voice smooth, almost musical, yet laced with venom. "I've been waiting for you." Lena didn't speak. She couldn't. The words stuck in her throat, paralyzed by the sheer weight of this being's presence. "Don't be afraid, child," the figure continued, stepping closer. "This is just the beginning. The door that you opened is not just a door, Lena. It's a gateway, a passage to something much greater than you can understand. You are not just a visitor. You are a part of this now." Lena wanted to scream, to push it away, to fight it, but her body refused to obey. Her limbs felt heavy, as though they were made of stone. Her mind was foggy, and for a moment she could barely remember why she was here. She didn't know how she had gotten here. She didn't know what had brought her to this nightmare. "You are mine now," the figure whispered, its voice becoming darker, more menacing. "And in time, you will understand your purpose here. You will see." With that, the figure reached out, its cold fingers brushing against Lena's cheek. The touch sent a shock of ice through her skin, and her heart skipped a beat. She wanted to recoil, to pull away, but her body didn't move. "You belong to me," the figure said again, its voice a low growl now. And then, it stepped back. The mist began to swirl again, thicker than before, and the figures, the watchers, moved once more, surrounding her, their empty eyes never leaving her. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling uncontrollably. She was lost in this nightmare, trapped in a world of shadows and whispers. The door, the one she had entered through, was gone, vanished as though it had never existed. She was no longer a visitor to this place. She was a part of it now, and the door she had opened had sealed her fate. The whispers were back, louder than ever. "You belong to us now." Chapter 10. The Binding. The walls of fog shifted once again, closing in like the oppressive weight of an invisible hand, pushing Lena into the center of this nightmare. She was no longer just a witness to the horrors around her. She was now a part of them, a piece of the puzzle, bound to this forsaken place. The air was thick with a presence, a feeling of being watched, as if the very mist itself had eyes, and those eyes were focused solely on her. Every movement she made was mirrored by the twisting shadows around her. The figures, the watchers, they had not left. Instead, they now hovered in the periphery, their twisted, contorted shapes slowly circling her, their vacant eyes gleaming with a hunger she couldn't fully comprehend. Lena's breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air seeping into her very bones. She could no longer feel the warmth of her body. Everything was frozen, suspended in this place. She wanted to run. She needed to escape. But her feet felt as though they were cemented to the ground, rooted in place by some dark, malevolent force. The tall, gaunt figure who had first spoken to her, the one with the glowing eyes, was now standing directly in front of her. Its pale face was closer than before, and its smile had twisted into something far more sinister. "Do you feel it, Lena?" the figure whispered. Its voice was like silk, smooth and melodic, yet the undertone carried an unmistakable cruelty. "The change, the pull. You are becoming one with us." She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The watcher's hand reached out slowly, its fingers, long and bony, grazing her cheek in a touch that sent ice through her veins. "You don't belong to yourself anymore," the figure continued, its smile widening as it leaned in closer. "You are ours, now and forever. You've opened the door, and you can never go back." Lena's head spun, a dizzying mix of fear, confusion, and despair. What door? What had she done? Her mind raced to recall the events that had led her here, but the fog in her memory was thick, blocking her thoughts like an impenetrable wall. The door, the one that had appeared out of nowhere, had seemed like her only option, the only way out of the maze of confusion that had plagued her for so long. But now, she knew it had been a trap, a gateway to something far worse than she could ever have imagined. The figure's fingers tightened around her throat, a vice-like grip that caused her to choke on the air. It wasn't painful, not at first, but it was suffocating, as though the very life was being drained from her. Her lungs burned, and yet she couldn't pull away. Her body refused to move. "Don't worry," the figure murmured, its voice oddly soothing. "You'll understand soon enough." The fog swirled around them, thickening, folding in on itself like a living, breathing thing. Lena's vision blurred, the shapes and shadows twisting in her mind as the Watcher's grip tightened. Her thoughts fractured, her consciousness slipping away, like a fading memory, and then suddenly, the pressure eased. The Watcher released her throat, and Lena collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. Her chest heaved with the desperate need for oxygen. But even as she sucked in the cold air, the taste of it was wrong, bitter and metallic, like the remnants of something dead. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, even as the mist closed in around her. It was like the fog itself was alive, reaching out, pulling at her, wrapping around her, suffocating her once again. "No!" she gasped, struggling to push herself up, but her body felt heavier than before. Her skin crawled, every inch of her body screaming for release, for freedom, but the Watchers stood, silent and still, their gazes fixed on her with unblinking eyes. "You can't leave," they whispered in unison. Their voices were hollow, eerie, like the sound of wind through the trees at midnight. The whisper echoed in the back of her mind, in the very air she breathed, until it was the only sound that existed. The words lingered, cold and insistent, carving themselves into her soul. The ground beneath her feet trembled, the earth shaking violently as the Watchers began to move again. Their twisted forms shifted in the mist, circling her like vultures around a carcass. But Lena knew better than to think she was the prey. She was no longer the victim. She was part of this world, part of the darkness that had claimed her, part of whatever was coming next. Her vision darkened, and for a moment, she thought she might lose consciousness. The air seemed to grow even colder, and the mist began to solidify, hardening into something more tangible, more oppressive. The figures stood around her in a perfect circle, their eyes burning into her, their shapes flickering in and out of focus as if they were not entirely of this world. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Lena's chest, a searing heat that spread outwards like wildfire. She gasped in shock, her hands flying to her ribs, but there was nothing there, no wound, no injury, just the unrelenting, excruciating pain. "You belong here," a voice whispered in her ear. It was the same voice that had spoken before, the one with the soft, hypnotic tone. But now, it was darker, colder. "And you always will." Lena's body jerked, as though a force beyond her control had seized her, and the world around her began to warp. The ground shifted beneath her feet, the fog swirling faster, tightening into a vortex. The Watchers, those faceless, twisted beings, flickered and blurred, their features becoming more monstrous with every passing second. They were no longer human, no longer anything she could recognize. Their forms were formless, shifting shadows of dread, and they closed in on her with unnatural speed. The pain in her chest intensified, and she felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart threatening to stop. The world was spinning, the fog choking out everything, and yet she could still hear their whispers, their voices filling the void. "You are bound to us, forever." A scream tore itself from her throat, but it was swallowed by the mist. The world was collapsing around her, the shadows closing in, the figures pressing closer, their eyes locked on hers as they pulled her deeper into the fog. And then, just as the darkness overtook her, she heard the words, "There is no escape.